Today, I'm talking authenticity, professionalism, and decolonising the mental health sector with the 2024 Australian Social Worker of the Year, Mishma Kumar-Jonson. Mish lives, learns, and supports community on the unceded lands of the Woiwurrung, Wurundjeri, and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and is a vociferous advocate for decolonising mental health sectors and for active allyship with Indigenous struggles around the world. As a social worker of colour, their practice is grounded in identity-affirming, anti-colonial, anti-oppressive practices from which they've built their skill set of supporting people through a range of modalities. Mish is a plural system that is non-binary, queer, disabled, and neurodivergent. And through their practice, Mish has become the chair of the Iceberg Foundation, a mental health charity for BIPOC, queer, and neurodivergent humans. And they're the principal practitioner at NIRM, a BIPOC-focused EMDR practice. Mish's favourite part of being part of the Iceberg Foundation is being with community and supporting people and staff to engage with their favourite selves, which I love. Mish, welcome to Unbiased.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm super excited for our chat today.
Likewise, Mish, because, in many ways, we come from other sides of the fence. Professionally speaking, I was born and raised in the corporate world, and your world is very much rooted in the community and social services sectors. But nevertheless, I think we are all in a state of play where we need to find answers from all avenues. And it's part of my mission through Unbiased to bring those together. And I'm sure that when it comes to authenticity, which is a big part of what we talk about on Unbiased, and bringing our favorite selves to work, which, as you so beautifully put it, for both of us, as for many others, that authenticity has a few more layers to break through in order to come to the fore, where outside of work, we may have been born and raised in a different environment altogether. So, Mish, there's a lot to unpack from all of your experience that I shared in the intro, and that's really what I love to do through the course of our chat. So let's start at the beginning. Can you share a bit more about your personal journey and how it's shaped your understanding of authenticity in professional life? And perhaps we can go from there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. It's a good place to start for sure. And before I jump in, I want to pay respects to the Wairarong, Wurundjeri, and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge that a lot of what we know about authenticity and showing up and connection to community and finding passion in our work, etc., comes from Indigenous wisdom that we continue to learn from and grow within. So just wanting to pay respects to the elders that I learn from daily. So great first question around my personal journey. I've had an interesting one. I was born in India and kind of spent some time there, but really spent a bulk of my childhood in the Middle East, and then
Okay.
in a small, or not a small country, but in a country called Oman. And I then moved to Australia, or so-called Australia, and was very privileged to settle within, Melbourne or Wairarong land and Wurundjeri land here. And what's really interesting about that journey is seeing the different ways of what India calls authenticity, what Swana, or some people know as the Middle East, calls authenticity, and then what Australia calls authenticity. And all those places are so different. And from a young age, learning that I need to show up in different ways in order to find attachments and in order to find community and in order to belong. And that has carried through my journey into my professional working life as a social worker, because I do inhabit a range of spaces and wear a range of hats. But what's the central tenet through all that is the values of authenticity, which is around self-awareness, around consistency, integrity, vulnerability, which we don't always prioritize, but also respecting others. And being able to find that through fluidity in all of those experiences has allowed me to come to a foundation now of being able to make decisions or interact with people, build relationships, or even build communities through this sense of authenticity.
What I think I've heard for one of the first times articulated when it comes to authenticity is those underlying principles that we need to put together. The way you've shared, it's that the value system and that understanding, so that you can already place authenticity into a different context depending on where you are. And that is so valuable because through my work and through other conversations that I've had, sometimes there can be almost there's a growing resistance or tension that exists with this word authenticity, because people that want to come up against this would say, well, does that give you a license to behave however you want, almost, because that is who you are. And one, I think always the great come back to that is really rooting authenticity in self-awareness. But also there can be this tension behind, you go down the self-awareness path and you understand you and in yourself and in relation to others, which necessarily kind of comes with it. But then if you stop there can be a tension between how you actually portray yourself in an authentic way, again, in those different contexts. And through lived experience across the world, I think your experience in and of itself has shown how you always have to adapt into those contexts, but without losing your sense of self. And what I wanted to do with your help is bring that together with your expertise as a mental health practitioner. So how do you translate and how do you support people to really ground their understanding of authenticity, to empower them to bring that to the fore without ending up, as I said, when I brought out the fact that we're at opposite sides of the fence, in a corporate setting, authenticity, similar to how you said about, Australia has an indication of what it means and the UAE has an indication of what it means. So what happens is that the loudest and most powerful and the most kind of established doctrine that will exist in your world becomes a singular definition of authenticity. And that's what can cause friction for people who go, now you're telling me to be authentic on one hand, but actually I'm finding that I'm having to necessarily mold myself in order to feel like I belong. Now, bring that all together, because there was just so much that you pulled out. My first question is, how do we actually almost physiologically bring those concepts to the fore to help each of us?
There is a brilliant clip on YouTube that I will send you to link in the show notes
Oh, in the show
that
notes, yeah.
it talks about authenticity versus attachment. And so when we think of human beings, we often think, okay, we need to be attached because we, are societal beings, we are in relation to each other, we need to understand how to live our lives in relationship with each other, communities, societies, etc. And there is actually a second really deep or innate need, which is also authenticity, because what that video that I'll send you posits is, imagine a person on the plains of wherever who was not authentic, who was not self-aware, who was not able to connect in with their understanding of their surrounding, whether the hairs were raising on the back of their neck or whether their palms were getting sweaty or their heart was racing. If they weren't connected, that meant a certain depth. Right? And so there are actually two needs that sit side by side with each other. One is attachment and one is authenticity. However, we learn at a very young age, attachment will win, because without attachment, I will lose the things that my life depends on, right? We all need attachments, especially us, because we don't really learn to walk until much later. We can't really fend for ourselves. We have no claws or wings or
Yeah.
anything like that. And so we're really dependent on the attachments around us. But what if those attachments can't handle our authentic self. What gets suppressed is our authentic self in order to prioritize that attachment need. And we then take that into adulthood and we continue to prioritize the attachment need, but forget that there's this innate authenticity need to be seen, to be heard, to be connected through this alignment of values, purpose, passion, etc. And Thema Bryant, who is a Black psychologist and president of the American Psychological Association, really focuses on this intersection and says there's a quote that says, "Homecoming is a return to authentic living that is based on truth, self acceptance, and aligning of action with values and purpose." And it's that thing of coming home physiologically by being aware authentically of what's happening in my body. So we think of authenticity in this almost sense of being authentic means doing what I want when I want at all times.
Yeah.
When in fact, authenticity is what is coming up for me and how do I align my actions with the values and purpose in order to meet the goals of whether this is connection, whether this is business, whether this is growing community, whether this is grant, find whatever the situation is. How do I align my actions with value and purpose in order to show up authentically? That is authenticity, not I get to do whatever whenever I want, because we're not then living within society and within that connection to each other, which is, remember, that attachment need we still have. So they
Yeah.
sit side by side, if that's resonating with you.
100%, because that's also something that I don't think I've had articulated to me in that way, that no, that is both that they are interrelated, but they are intrinsically interconnected at a really deep internal level. So if we continue that, the sort of unpicking that thread of the physiology, what I also see that distinction in is our heads and our, having this sort of intellectual concept of how we need to be, with marrying it. What I'm hearing from you is that actually there's something kind of somatic and physical that we should be doing in order to actually then for the penny to drop in all other aspects of ourselves, of that interconnection, and to remove that tension, as I said, that I do hear exists for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And one of the hardest things to do, I think, or I've seen, is to start becoming self-aware. And so there's a quote, and I will quote a lot of people of color, especially queer and trans people of color, because I think this is where we get to, really uplift voices. Minda Harts is a woman of color who says, we need to be on the front line of our own issues, but often we put other people on the front line of our issues and then hold them accountable when our needs are not being met. So on a physiological level, what happens in society is we have to divorce ourselves or dissociate ourselves from our need in order to push past boundaries, in order to not have needs met, yet continue those relationships or conversations or whatever that is. There needs to be a removing of self on a continuous basis to still show up to work when the world's on fire, for
Yeah.
example, right?
Yeah.
To still have water cooler chats when there might be grief and deep anxiety, despair, sitting in the body. That is a survival mechanism and a coping strategy a lot of us use. And so what's then really difficult is the unlearning of that. So, I often say to people, it's the learning itself comes. It's the unlearning that you go, oh, this is sore, this is like really hard work. And on a physiological level, if we can start dropping into some of those authentic spaces, you then start to have this connection between brain, body, between values and soma, which is, your nervous system and your limbs. Why am I starting to feel a little bit nauseated when I'm having this conversation with someone? Why do I have these gut feelings or these inklings and I ignore it and I ignore it? And then someone asks me, how are you feeling? Or, what do you think about this? And you go, I'm not really sure because I've learned to not trust myself. And so
Yeah.
in situations that calls for trusting myself, it feels inauthentic. And so I think there is a space there more to explore that sense of self-awareness, and at the same time explore, what does vulnerability of dropping into that space actually do to us?
Yeah.
And can we learn to sit with that?
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you get people to, I hear this a lot, just can you drop into, and it's always this that uses the same like gesticulation, like, and I know as a typical head person that is spending so much time trying to get into, what does it mean to get down to your gut, to get down to that heart and to that somatic level? Because it makes sense. It totally makes sense when you say it. And then I'm like, right, what was the first thing I would do
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
get there, because part of that unlearning is it's actually part of the resistance almost, is not trusting yourself.
100%. And, I think when you spend so long in the mental health sector, you hear of these things and you understand these
Yeah.
concepts, and then you're like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a whole world that exists outside of
Yeah,
this
so please,
space.
and demystify it, because
Yeah.
I, in a time when the world is on fire,
Yeah.
I think a lot of the problem is that there's not a shared understanding of what these terms mean, even though when I hear it from you, this affects all humans. Like it's just part of who we are as a species. And instead we're allowing polarization and labels and identities to start playing against each other. So I really want to want to drop down that layer to all the things that we have categorically got in common, which are organs and breath and brains and hearts and guts.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to give you 3 ways.
Okay.
And these come from deep indigenous wisdom and knowing. So I want to highlight that and pay respect to that,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the first is something called parts work. So anyone who kind of does somatic work or trauma therapy will know what I'm talking about. Parts work is acknowledging that we all have parts of ourselves that show up in different spaces of our lives. And a really great example of this, a little bit of a cheeky example, that, when I am being a therapist, the parts that show up is the therapist part and the co-therapist part in that room. And one day I was working from home and my wife came home a bit early. It was my last session. And so she could just hear me in session, but she couldn't hear the other person. But, and I came out of that session and she went, I've never heard that really beautiful, compassionate voice before. I'm just wondering, where's that person? And I said, oh, honey,
Where's
you
that?
didn't, that wasn't the person you married. No, no, no. You married the sassy, I'm gonna tell you what's happening. That's who you married. And she was like, oh, got it. Okay, cool. But we all have parts of
Yeah.
ourselves, right, that show up. Now,
Yeah.
the dropping in aspect of this is,
Yeah.
one, acknowledging that the reason those parts exist, even the ones that you don't want to exist, the reasons they
Yeah.
exist is because there was a situation in which you needed a coping strategy or someone to step in, and so this part was born. Sometimes we
Okay.
want to get rid of angry parts. We want to get rid of, parts who are quote unquote sensitive. We want to get rid of these parts that we don't think are doing anything for us, but we forget that they were needed and they're trying to keep us safe. So one way is just sitting with ourselves and acknowledging and saying thank you when they show up, and say, I see you're trying to protect me. I see you're trying to hold space for me. I see that I don't know what to do, and so you have had to step in from a young age or whenever that is to tell me what to do, and start to really connect in with different parts. So that's one way of dropping in, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And the second way is Stan Grant, who is an Indigenous Australian journalist and author, often speaks about authenticity and storytelling, because what they say is history will always underscore division and conflict, always.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
storytelling with each other roots us in the collective knowing that we live in relationship with each other. right? And so that is another way to drop in, because sometimes it's hard to drop in the body, but you can drop into stories. You can find relatability and your own body and your own journey in other people's story, and then you know you're not alone. That's another thing you can drop into. And that's where authentic storytelling and the finding in each other, that's the notion that Sam Grant talks about, is another way to drop in, right? Because you're dropping into your own story. And then the third way
Yeah.
with your body is starting to just be a little bit aware of your limbs, right? So if I sit here and, and if I was to just scan my body and go, what's happening? I would tell you my right shoulder's a bit tight. My legs are a bit sore because I went for a walk and I don't do much physical activity. I'm holding a bit of tension in my neck. And then starting to ask the question, what's that about? Why is there tension in my neck? And listening. That's when you start dropping into the somatic sensations. And the reason is you can have neck up and neck down experiences of the same situation. And I can give you an
Okay.
example of this. So, say you have a car accident that's tiny, there was no damage. Someone was stopped at a light, you hit them from behind, very tiny. You get out of the car, you're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. You might use some expletive, and you might get there and you go, oh, nothing actually happened. The other person gets out of the car, you don't exchange licenses because you're like, nothing actually happened. And you might get in the car and go, oh, thank God. I could not afford the damage. I could not afford this. Could you imagine you start doing this? Like, could you
Yeah.
imagine? Oh my God, I would have been late for
Yeah.
work. But the real notion under that is, oh, thank God, it's over. There's nothing, right? That's the neck up. Neck down, you might be in full fight or flight mode because something big and dangerous has happened. It doesn't know that all's okay. Your neck up knows, but your body's going, are we in danger? Holy shit, could we have died? Because car accident means death. And when you start going, could you imagine what have happened? The body's going, yeah, I am imagining, I'm doing. But we don't often acknowledge that experience, that neck down experience. We only ever sit in the neck up experience and then go, get over it, nothing happened. And you're like, but for my
Yeah.
body,
Yeah.
everything happened. Can you see? Those are
Yeah.
the three ways that I can offer.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel when I was listening to that, it feels like almost I feel like I'd need all three together to work it through. So we've got that part and going, right, we actually have to be really honest with ourselves and go and acknowledge and laugh and love the fact that we have all these different parts are at play, and we know intuitively that we all keep switching in and out depending on our context. And then there's the last one in particular of actually stopping to actually sit and listening to your body. Again, for people that are just go, 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 and in the world that we live in, your example of the car is exactly what I see. So I have a tendency to it, and I see it in the corporate world. We come, how are you? Oh, fine, fine. Oh yeah, had this happen, this happened, this happened. And then you end up in this is how I think burnout happens, because no one's ever actually acknowledged these, oh, that was just a little thing, or that didn't amount to anything, and I dodged a bullet with that. What is wrong with me? Why am I feeling like so knackered all the time, and I'm not meeting my KPIs, but I can't tell my boss that because that's just some feeling stuff, but it's not playing out. So I feel like we have to then touch on your sweet spot through all of your work, through the Iceberg Foundation, and you can tell us a bit more about that, because I'll absolutely want to share information about that. But between you being like rooted and sharing that wisdom, I really thank you for sharing that as well, because it's, again, understanding the data that sits behind stories and all of that, and where it comes from is really important for people to know when they do have their aha moment, and then they've had the 5-point plan to beating burnout.
Yeah.
But I want you to explain what that means, because I feel like I've been hearing elements of it through the examples that you give of this wisdom, but also through your sharing of how I feel like most of us are living in the neck up world, or behaving or responding to neck up in how we behave, and not necessarily the neck down, which I think is a sort of a factor of the narrative that's been driven, and the narrative that history has driven us to. So how can we think about this deeper, and how does this link to your mission to decolonize the mental health sector, so that we can help more people?
These are massive questions, and I know that, we don't have, I would
Let's
love to, kind of sit
continue
and
with this.
talk, but
Yeah,
I'm going to give you
yeah,
some
yeah.
headliners or highlights so that people can go away and think more deeply about it, but
Yeah,
one of the things that's really important to know is conformity will always minimize our differences for the quote unquote greater good. So there's that sense of if we don't conform, we will be abandoned. And there's
yeah,
no loneliness, as Alex said, there's no loneliness like having people only see you after you've erased yourself. Right. And so if you're in situations where you have to completely erase yourself to be seen, of course, dropping in and responding to neck down things will feel incredibly unsafe. Because for the first time, you're going to have to acknowledge there's a neck down. And what I want to make really clear is this is a lifelong unlearning and learning and relearning, unlearning process.
yeah,
Lifelong. This is not a, I do some breath work for half an hour and then I'm good
yeah,
kind of situation, right? And the reason the Iceberg Foundation logo is block colors, sharp edges up the top, and then colorful swirls, curves down the bottom is because of this. Neck up is what we think about when we think about professionalism, showing up completely masked, highly performing our genders or our roles or our sexualities or whatever that is. And then down, we have these beautiful, creative, passionate parts of ourselves that never see the light of day, right? And I think where to start is one, establishing, can my body sit with the notion of safety? Because when you have been responding to coping with unsafety and unsafe for so long, safe is actually super dangerous, because safe means put down all of those swords and shields. But then parts of you go, excuse me, if we put all that down, everything we deem dangerous is going to hit us square in the chest, and that's it. And so unsafety can be super uncomfortable. Can we just start there? What does safety even look like? And you'll get parts of that will reject it straight away and go, I don't have time for it. Do you see how many deadlines I have? Are you joking? I have to stay up late to do all this, blah, 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 blah. I've heard it and I say this, so I'm not sitting here as someone who's reached
yeah,
nirvana.
yeah,
I'm in this.
yeah,
But it's first starting with, can we see that we deserve moments of safety? Can we see that we deserve moments of coming back to homecoming, as I talked about at the start,
yeah,
right? Because that'll be step one. That is like putting on the shoes to go walking. Can we even just cope with that thing? Then step two is about, if we can cope with safety for a little while, where are the connections and the relationships and the people and the communities that are going to nurture that? Because I'm not always going to be able to show up from that place at all times. Because one, not everyone deserves that. Two, not everywhere is safe to show up in that way.
yeah,
And three, I might not have the spoons, or the energy to show up in that way. But if I have to mask, right? If I have to perform for my job or whatever that is, where are the spaces that are going to nurture those authentic parts of me, those ones that are around safety and homecoming? So that's the second bit. And then the unlearning very slowly is around, can there be moments of authentic color that show up in the corporate life or, my job or professionalism? Because remember, professionalism is fluid. At one point, it was really professional to be X, and then at other points, it's really professional to be
yeah,
something else, right? So acknowledging
yeah,
that and coming back to, can we see ourselves through our ancestors' eyes rather than the colonizer's gaze? Because, or the imperialist gaze, because that's when we start going, what would our ancestors would have wanted for us when they were dreaming up us through joy and, what would that have been? Can I find those bits of myself? So I've given you some big headlines for people to
Yeah.
go away and look in, but these are a few steps, people can take. And again, I said it's lifelong, but find the communities, find the relationships, find the people that you can start to find safety with, and then from there, authenticity, and then start maybe showing up a little bit, authentically in certain spaces. It's all not about all or nothing, but about slow transitions.
That's friends.
And I
Yeah.
just want to add one thing before I stop, which is this thing around skill regression. So a lot of people think,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I've been masking for so long. I've been showing up inauthentically at work. I'm going to start showing up really authentically and, doing this. And then you start going, I can't get through the day like I used to. I don't have the patience like I used to. I no longer know how to do my job because everything you had built before was on the foundation of inauthenticity. Once you start dismantling the foundations of inauthenticity, you are going to have skill regression. But this is such a beautiful and really, really heartbreakingly difficult job to start rebuilding yourself through authentic
Yeah.
foundations.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to give people a little, a little note of
Yeah.
that might happen.
Yes, as you said, it's a starting point, and there are so many avenues that anyone who listens is really invited to go down as to what works for them. But I feel like it's a real call to action for those who are out there who are feeling burnt out, who are feeling like something has to change, but they don't know where to start, or have been able to accept actually when intellectually they might start to know they need to try something they haven't before, but there'll be that fear and anxiety. One, that sounds from what you said to be completely normal because it's not safe yet for you.
Yeah.
And that to acknowledge that takes courage. I know when we talk about the
Yes.
safe spaces, I much prefer walking into a space that's being demarcated as courageous because it starts to prime ourselves for acknowledging that difficult things might be said, and this is not a way to. Sometimes I feel like safe space can mean censorship. We think, I'm going to not say stuff because I need to maintain this concept of safety that is also, again, can be attached to maybe the most powerful or loudest voice in a room. Whereas courage is saying, no, I want to think about how I say what I know I need to say or do. So I will share all the links and that you've shared with me. And I also really love and invite everyone to just rest on the image of the iceberg, which again is used in so many different contexts. But your depiction invites us to do is to say that actually what lies beneath is where the beauty is at, is where the creativity is at. And so it's inviting you to go, actually, it's okay to expose a bit more of that once we've actually used all those colors to paint the picture that is ourselves. And so this conversation, Mish, has really depicted everything that Unbiased is about. And it is just about those conversation starters, because when we move from judgment to curiosity, that necessarily means that we are going to have more questions than answers. We are going to have to accept that there's complexity and there is time involved to affecting the change that we want to see in ourselves. And so to end and close out, I'm going to ask you to leave us with what I ask all my guests to, which is, out of everything that you shared and the world that you're operating in and striving to achieve things in, what is a question that you think we should be asking more of ourselves and of others?
Yeah, beautiful. It's a question I ask myself a lot, which is, It's a two-parter. The first is, who is my favorite self? And the second is, how do I create spaces in which my favorite self can show up?
I love that so much. Thank you, Mish, for taking time out to share your wisdom and the wisdom of your ancestors with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. I derive so much energy from speaking to such inspiring guests and having really meaningful and challenging conversations. If you felt the same way, my ask of you is to please subscribe to this podcast, either here or wherever you download your podcast content from. Unbiased is a labour of love for me, and the impact that these perspectives have depend on reaching as many eyes and ears as possible. So your support is invaluable. Until next time, stay curious.